katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Welcome to this Transformational Waste Strategy webinar. Thank you for joining us. While we are waiting for everyone to join, if you'd like to put your name in the chat and where you're tuning in from. We'll just wait for a few minutes while everybody joins us. But looking forward to this evening and the kōrero on a new waste strategy for Aotearoa and new waste legislation. Kia ora, Marien. Thanks for putting your name and where you're from in the chat, and welcome to other people coming online. And while we're waiting for everyone to join us, if you'd just like to put your name and where you're based in the chat. Kia ora. Just leave it for another minute or so as people come on and join us. Kia ora Rashimi, kia ora Pamela, Tiffany. Quite a range of interest from around the country. Kia ora. Welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in. We're just waiting for people to come online before we formally start this webinar. And while we're waiting, if you'd like to put your name and where you're based in the chat. Kia ora Julie. Kia ora Wim. Eileen. Tēnā koutou. Welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in this evening. We're just spending a minute while people come online and then we'll get started very shortly. So while we're waiting, if you'd like to put your name and where you're tuning in from in the chat. Kia ora. So I think we will start with our opening karakia. Kia tō te rangamare o te ranganui e tunei, o papatuanuku e takato nei, o te taiao e awhi nei, ki runga i a tātou tihei Māori ora. May the peace of the sky above, of the earth below, and the world all around rest upon us. Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Ko Eugenie Sage ho. I'm a Green MP and really delighted to be facilitating this webinar tonight, which is being live streamed on Facebook. Just a few housekeeping things before we start. The webinar is being recorded and will be sent out in a link tomorrow with some links to submission guides. If you're not familiar with Zoom, the chat function is at the bottom of the screen in the middle, and you can message everyone or just message individuals that you may see that are attending. And the chat function is also where we are putting questions. So if you'd like to put your question for the panelists in there with a Q in front of it, Rosalie, who's working with us, will harvest those, and when we get to that section, we will try and answer as many questions as possible. But given that there are over 50 people on the webinar, we probably won't be able to get to them all, but we'll try and get to as many as possible. And the webinar will run until 8. I'll give a bit of an overview of the consultation process on the National Waste Strategy and the legislation and why it's important to make a submission. And then we'll invite each of our panelists to talk for 5 minutes each about what needs to be improved in the waste strategy, and then we will have a bit of kōrero between the panelists and then open it up at around just after 7:35 to questions from participants. And would really like to thank our panelists this evening. We have Sarah Pritchett from WasteMINZ, which is the waste sector organisation. It's been running a lot of seminars and doing a lot of mahi on improving waste policy across Aotearoa. Kia ora, Sarah.
Kia ora, Eugenie.
Kahurangi Carter from Parakore, and Parakore is doing wonderful work across the Motu, educating people on waste, particularly on marae, and really making a difference in terms of just changing the whole culture around waste on marae. Kia ora, Kahurangi.
Tēnā koutou and tēnā koutou katoa.
And our third panellist is Sue Coutts of Wanaka Wastebusters fame, and now with the Zero Waste Network and also on the Waste Advisory Board. So 3 panelists with a lot of expertise in the waste space. So just briefly to introduce why we're doing this seminar is because in the last term of government, when I had the privilege of being the Associate Minister with responsibility for waste, we got a number of changes underway in terms of taking steps towards mandatory product stewardship so that producers, retailers, consumers all take responsibility for products through their life cycle, increasing the landfill levy, putting a ban on plastic bags, a number of practical measures. But it was quite obvious that the waste minimisation legislation, because it was developed as way back in 2007, 2008, really good principles in it, and the previous national government hadn't done a lot to actually use it. But there are opportunities to improve the Waste Minimisation Act, and also our current waste strategy dates back a number of years. It doesn't have enough of a commitment to avoiding waste, to recognising the impact of waste in landfills in terms of climate emissions, the potential to reduce waste there. And so government, Environment Minister David Parker, who's now responsible for waste, has notified a proposal to have new legislation and also to develop a new waste strategy. The Green Party has developed a bit of a submission guide, and it's on our action.greens.org website, and that will share that link. But we really need a lot of submissions from the public and organisations about what you think is really critical in the waste space, where you'd like to see the waste strategy, what issues you'd like to see the waste strategy emphasise, where you think there could be significant improvements in the framework for managing waste in Aotearoa, what direction central government needs to give through the strategy to councils, which do a lot of the work in terms of recycling around the Aotearoa, how we can support community organisations more, and how we can make those who are designing, producing and selling products take much more responsibility for those products across the course of their life. So I would like to turn now to our panellists and just to invite Sarah from WasteMINZ. Sarah, what do you think are the key things that really should be to the fore in a new waste strategy and new waste minimisation legislation?
Kia ora, Eugenie. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki Eugenie koutou ko Kahurangi ko Sue. Kia ora koutou. Yeah, so I work for WasteMINZ, which is a large membership organisation for the waste and resource recovery sector. We have about 1,500 members, and they represent quite varying perspectives on how we should manage waste and reduce it and recover it. So I can't speak on behalf of WasteMINZ members, but my views are very much informed by many of our members, and I could see some of their names popping up. So kia ora to my colleagues from WasteMINZ. And I just want to start, sorry, Eugenie, I just want to start by acknowledging all the mahi you did when you were Associate Minister for the Environment, especially in the waste sector when you had that portfolio, and for shining a spotlight on the much neglected waste and resource recovery sector. So just wanted to thank you for that and for your ongoing support for all the work in the sector. So as Eugenie said, over the last few weeks, we've been holding webinars and workshops for our members on the waste strategy, the proposed waste strategy and legislation, to give our members the opportunity to hear directly from the Ministry for the Environment, to ask them questions and to also discuss amongst themselves what they think is positive about the consultation and what might be missing. And so as part of the conversations I've been part of anyway, some strong themes have come through. And one is that there's not enough focus on addressing the root cause of waste, which is of course the fact that we have too much stuff, and the stuff that we do have is often not designed to be reusable, repairable, even recyclable. So that's something that needs to come through more strongly in the legislation. And I think through the legislation, we could have a stronger signal to business that we can't just keep producing things faster, selling more, getting people to replace their products instead of having longevity of products. So we'd really love to see that come through more and stop acting like waste is this thing at the bottom that we have to deal with, but try and prevent it actually being created in the first place. So that's one thing. And another thing that's come through quite strongly in the conversations I've been part of is the need for a Te Tiriti framework. And I think Kahurangi will, and Sue will probably talk more on this. But we can't really have a partnership or a adequate way of engaging with tangata whenua unless we have a Te Tiriti framework. And I think a lot of people were quite surprised that there wasn't one. There wasn't an overarching framework informed by Te Tiriti. So that's something that's really missing, and it'd be a way of us acknowledging that we can learn from Te Ao Māori, and it would also be a way of making sure that Māori tangata whenua have a seat at the decision-making table, and also it would ensure that as we transition to a different type of economy, that no one is left behind because the participation is ensured. So those are my main things. Thank you.
Kia ora, Sarah. Thank you for that. So, Kahurangi, going to you now. Maybe you'd like to provide a little bit of background about Parakore and its work, and then picking up the themes that sort of Sarah's raised in terms of how you get a better Te Tiriti partnership, and any of the other key things that you think it would be good for people to highlight in the submissions.
Yes, kia ora, Eugenie, and Sarah and Sue and Rosalie in the background there, and kia ora mo tō karakia tīmata. Yeah, so I'll start with my pepeha. So ko Kahurangi taku ingoa, ko mōtaki ora te maunga, ko manga kewa te awa no Ngāti Manupoto. Ko karioi te maunga, ko whaingaro te moana, waikato tainui te iwi. So Parakore, we're a Māori non-for-profit organisation with a kaupapa based on whakapapa te papatūānuku, our Earth Mother, and we deliver education to more than 570 marae, kura, kohanga reo and organisations around Aotearoa. And our vision is oranga taiao, oranga marae, oranga whānau. So our goal is to educate and advocate from Te Ao Māori, and to empower our connection with Rangi Nui, our Sky Father, and Papatūānuku, our Earth Mother. Yeah, so I'm definitely going to expand upon some of the things that Sarah's already mentioned. And I've got like 4 main areas that I'd like to see improvement. So number 1, the main issue that we have with the strategy and reform of the Waste Minimisation Act has been developed outside of a Crown Māori partnership. So Māori have been excluded from formal input and decision making in legislation and policy making. The consultation document represents the Crown's perspective. And so Māori are only referenced as a group who we need to work with or engage with. So this defines Māori as excluded from those setting the policy or legislation. So we reject the notion of Māori contributing through consultation or advising. To summarise, there's no reference to Te Tiriti or Waitangi in principles in Te Ao Māori and partnership as it stands. So the second area for improvement is that the strategy and legislation does not address the root cause of the issue with waste, which is that waste exists through design. And so the existence of waste stems from a deep systemic failure and requires systemic solutions. So New Zealand's extractive, linear, colonial and hyper-consumerist systems has waste productions embedded in the design. And so making changes from within the system to improve waste disposal or better management of waste is irresponsible, and it's bound to fail in achieving the transformational change that's required. The strategy focuses on the consumer's waste and not on companies and the systems that produce the waste. And the third improvement is to the level of ambition and urgency. It's 2021. We need transformational change, and it's really required. So era scale change, this is like a once in this generation chance to safeguard our species, address global heating, pollution, biodiversity loss, and stop the imminent destruction of communities and livelihoods. All action must be planned for completion by 2030. 2050 is too far away. And, oh, sorry, you were going to say something? No, okay. And my fourth improvement would be that we propose an establishment of a Crown Māori national agency responsible for oranga tai ao. Doesn't it sound great? The agency, built on partnership, will provide leadership and define environmental standards and a level of ambition for our South Pacific nation. Our National Agency for Oranga Tai Ao will be tasked with leading era-scale transformational change whilst displaying inclusiveness, agility, and responsiveness. And a proposed statutory agency would be mandated to operationalise the waste strategy, the Waste Minimisation Act, and other relevant environmental legislation, strategy reviews, and reform. The only acceptable outcome from the waste strategy is restoring Papatūānuku, Ranginui, Tangaroa, and all our native species to optimal health. Separating ourselves from nature is not an option. Ko o te awa, ko o. Ko ora te whenua, ka ora te tangata. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Kahurangi. Just a follow-up question. In terms of Oranga Tai Ao, the new agency, do you see that as being much wider than waste or focusing on waste?
It would be much wider than waste, but there would be a focus on looking at top of the cliff solutions and reaching communities at the level, because we believe that the communities know what is best for the community, and what's good for the community is good for the entire country. So Pa McGowan, he says it very eloquently. I've got it written down here so I don't forget. Those best able to listen and respond to the land should be the people who are making decisions about it.
Kia ora. Thank you, and we'll come back to that kōrero. So Sue, welcome. In terms of Zero Waste Network, would you describe what they're focused on and just what Zero Waste Network and you believe are some of the key points that are needed in having a new waste strategy and new legislation?
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity. It's great to be here with you guys, and I'm just going to crack straight into it because I've got a lot of points. Yeah, so I guess the thing that's really interesting to us is the connection to circular economy. I don't think the waste strategy articulates that very well. For us, the circular economy story is a really good way of starting to think about, instead of talking about the waste, looking at the waste and talking about the waste and focusing on waste, we can look upstream and start talking about the materials that we're extracting from the natural world, which are the things that's causing a lot of the biodiversity problems. It's 90% of biodiversity loss is really extraction. And so if we can have things, circular economy is really about having things going around forever in our systems so that we don't need to extract anything else and we don't need to cast anything out as waste. I think that point has been lost in the document. Really keen to see people who know a bit about circular economy put some points in about that in their submissions. It really connects the dots between reducing waste and reducing emissions as well, which, as we know, is a big piece of the puzzle at the moment. It's a really big driver for government, and we're really trying to.
There's a bit of lag here, but keep going, Sue, and maybe come close to the computer. Yep.
Okay, I'll just go maybe a little bit slower. Yeah, so really keen to see that connection made with consumption emissions and not just landfill emissions. Landfill emissions only 4% of our total emissions, and consumption emissions are really around 50% of the emissions that we generate. So there's a lot of opportunities to change our emissions profile as a country, if we look at the emissions that are coming from the goods that are being produced and the goods that are being consumed. One of the really big gaps that we see in the document is there's not really any story about how we're going to go from the words, the writing, the policy ideas to action in the world. So we've got local government, we've got enterprise, and we've got all the civil society actors that are working on the ground now. And what we think we need is an agency, a bit like ECA, but for materials and resources, that sits in between government and the actors, and they're a coordinating body, they're an enabling body, they're bringing people together, and they're the ones who distribute all the funds that are coming through the WMF. And we would really like to see that there, because we think that that will mean that there's just that gear that's going to get something to happen. This is our third waste strategy in 20 years. We haven't seen a lot of action. And the third thing that I think is really important for our world is to see money going into the local scale. I think that's the most important thing that we really want to see happening. We want to see money going into those local zero waste hubs and facilities at that level. And we want to see money going into local behavior change programs. You guys are all frozen. I'm wondering if I am.
No, keep going, Sue. You're
okay.
fine.
Yep. Yeah. So we want to see a good whack of the money from the waste minimization fund dropping into, I guess what we're saying really is we want to see government delegate some of its jobs. In the strategy, they're saying, oh, we're going to do all the education. And you're like, well, actually, there's a massive network of people across the country who already are really great at that. All they need is money in their pockets to be able to carry on doing that job. They speak the language of their local people. They understand, they're there for the long haul. They can develop those relationships that can really drive big change. And we would like to see that behavior change work cutting right across into climate change adaptation, resource recovery, new ways of growing food, and making all those connections. And the last thing that I think is really important is in the document, organics really only appear as problematic emissions generators. That the only story that's being told about organics is that they emit methane. There's no story about getting organics back to soil, no story about all of the things up, right up the waste hierarchy to do with organics. And so we're arguing that there needs to be a much broader understanding of what organics really is, so that people can, it's not seen as just a problem. We really want to get it flowing back around into soil, composting programs and all that kind of stuff.
Kia ora, Sue, and sorry about the tech issues we've got there, but just a follow-up question. In terms of just experience with Wanaka Wastebusters and your suggestion that a lot more resources go to local organisations, can you just describe what Wastebusters did with getting those sort of local resources, and how you might get similar organisations elsewhere if the strategy did have that emphasis?
The problem with the strategy as it stands is there's no discussion of the money story. So it doesn't tell any kind of story about where the money's going to come from to fund this work. There's a really good reason why it's not happening now, because we're not designing the systems of economic instruments to get money into covering the costs associated with the ongoing running costs of doing work, resource recovery work, and we're not feeding money into the capital costs associated with creating facilities and getting things happening on the ground, like building plants or equipment. And I think that a good example maybe is container return scheme. It's something that people know a bit about. If we could get a container return scheme which contains an advanced disposal fee, then the cost of handling every single container that comes through the system is already covered when somebody buys it. And that means that money, instead of Wastebusters having to either look to the customer to pay for when they drop off their recycling, or the council to pay, or to try to fund it out of other work, like subsidize it with money through the reuse shop. The product itself has it has money attached to it which goes right through the system, and that money needs the funds from the container return scheme would need to cover the costs of the capex to set up all the system to harvest all the materials, and that would be obviously over time, and it would also have to cover the opex, so that's the handling fee associated. People often just think about the deposit, but it's really that those other the other money that covers the cost of the resource recovery system that's really important.
Thank you. Sarah, coming back to you, just in terms of the container return scheme, which government has done consultation, well, the whole idea of a container return scheme for beverage containers as a product stewardship scheme. Is there enough in the strategy around product stewardship, and do you want to talk about that concept a bit more and how that could potentially be strengthened?
Yeah, so I think there is not enough in the strategy about that or the legislation. So as mentioned, but it could really change the way I think it's internalised costs. So the cost of the life cycle of the product, as Sue just mentioned with the container return scheme, could be applied to all sorts of products. And again, Eugenie, you sort of started the ball rolling with that legislation that we already had that existed. That meant that you could declare a priority product, which would then go on to have a regulated product stewardship scheme designed for it. And so six of those are in progress at the moment. But that took 10 years for that lever to be pulled, and we can't wait another 10 years. As Kahurangi said, this is urgent. We need to just take action now, because we can't wait another 10 years to get to work and to try and shift the business model and the way we think about costs as being separate to, so say if we have my phone, for example, I don't necessarily have the cost of the disposal attached to this at the moment. So when I buy it, there's nothing to cover it going through its life cycle. There's nothing to cover it being repaired, and there's nothing at the end of its life to cover the cost of recycling it. So I would have to pay for that at the moment. So if we shift that responsibility onto the producer, who often shares it with the consumer by building the fee into the product, then we can actually start to pay for better outcomes because the cost is covered throughout it. But what the product stewardship schemes need is to have some kind of eco-modulated fee which actually incentivizes better design. So in France, for example, they're the only country who've used eco-modulation so far, and they do have some lessons that I think we could learn from, because it was probably quite a broad-ranging goal they had with the eco-modulation. But basically, eco-modulation means that businesses who produce items that are made to be durable and repairable and recyclable, they will have less of a fee to pay at the start when their product is put on the market. And companies who carry on making items that don't last and can't be repaired and can't be recycled or aren't made from recycled content, they are penalised through that different varied fee.
Kia ora, Sarah. Just while people are thinking up questions to ask, and if you would like to put any questions you have, and no question is a silly question, so in the chat, just a few more questions to the panelists, but please do put some questions in the chat. Kahurangi, in terms of if there was a genuine Te Tiriti partnership, you've mentioned a new agency, Oranga Taiao, but in terms of doing consultation, local authorities doing consultation about waste minimisation in their districts, any thoughts there on what the strategy could encourage?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, so far, the Crown has displayed quite poor management of the care of the taiao and Aotearoa's natural resources. And so we want to align that with the well-being of our taonga and, you know, access to chieftainship of knowing that we have this ancestral knowledge that's been handed down to us. When we talk about circular economies, we do it from a very Eurocentric view without honouring that it is actually the way that Māori and many Indigenous people lived. So it would look like a true Crown and Māori partnership where decision making wasn't just about having an advisory board whose recommendations could be ignored. It would be about living by the principles of Te Tiriti, like the sacred document that's been gifted to us by these chiefs who have had the knowledge of living in balance and with Te Taiao. And so it would start with that true partnership.
Kia ora. So we've had the first of the questions, which has come in from Faye and came in before the webinar. And Faye asks, I want to know if New Zealand will ever burn rubbish for energy instead of burying it and creating methane instead of CO2, as is the case in Northern European countries. Sweden creates central heating from a central base, or maybe there are developing technologies to reduce these emissions. Before I go to the panelists, would just note that last night there was a webinar that a Swiss company ran about waste to energy, and there is a proposal for a scheme in Waimati, which community organisation Why Waste Waimati has established to really campaign against, because of major concern about emissions, about no emphasis on the top of the waste hierarchy in terms of avoiding waste. I've got concern about if we move to waste to energy on a big scale, these plants have got a very high capital cost. They need a lot of waste to feed them, and so there's no incentive to avoid or reduce waste. And we've already had in Christchurch problems with an operator storing plastic bales of waste in the hope that this plant will be established in Waimati, and residents and others being concerned about that because of the impacts of just storing waste either in a shed or in the open. So, Sarah, with WasteMINZ there, and your background knowledge of waste to energy, do you have any comments on whether we should be burning rubbish for energy instead of taking it to landfill?
Yeah, so once again, a disclaimer, I can't speak on behalf of the WasteMINZ membership, but I just support what you said, Eugenie, which is that it's not focusing on preventing waste. It's just finding a solution for this thing that we have at the end that we're not quite sure what to do with because we haven't worked out how to stop creating it in the first place. And as you also mentioned, it can end up in a scenario where you have to feed the beast. And I think there's instances of countries importing waste to burn for energy to keep feeding that, which is something we're trying to stop doing. Is we're trying to stop globally shifting our waste problem to other jurisdictions. We can't keep doing that. We have to stop it from being created in the first place, and then own the problem ourselves with the residual waste we do have, which hopefully eventually we won't have.
Thanks, Sarah. Sue, would you like to just waste for energy your views? Is there a role for any smaller plants or for ever happening in Aotearoa?
We're, I guess I would rather not see waste to energy because it's just another linear strategy for destroying materials. Whether you're it's a disposal strategy. So whether you're burning it or whether you're burying the same thing for the economy. If you think about what we were talking about earlier, that anything you burn or bury, you need to extract the gain from the beginning. So you've got to pull it out of the environment. You're drawing it into the system if you're burning it from one, if you're burning or burying it at the other end. And so what we're looking for with the circular economy is a closed loop. We're trying to draw some materials in and then keep them in circulation for as long as we possibly can so that we don't need to pull anything else out of the environment to look after, to meet our own needs. And I think something that I found really useful in thinking about it was the idea that what burns in our rubbish is either plastic or organics. And if we're burning plastic, we're just burning fossil fuels, and the fossil fuel industry is doing a great job of saying, well, okay, so transport, we're sort of losing market share in the transport side because obviously people are starting to shift away from fossil fuels for transport, and they're moving really fast into plastics. And then obviously a lot of the plastics that they're producing are short life, single use, and they're not really recyclable. So then the obvious answer that they come up with is an incinerator, which is just another way of burning fossil fuels. And as soon as I realized that, I was just like, oh, that makes absolutely no sense. It's just a different way of burning fossil fuel. And so what we know is that 75% of the stuff in our rubbish can easily be recycled using pretty simple tools. Places like Extreme Waste can recycle 75%, without even blinking. I think it was something like somewhere between 350 to 700 million to put a incinerator in, and you can put a lot of solar panels up for that. So if we're looking for energy, there's much better ways of investing in renewable energy. So that's what I would say. Obviously, we do need to do way better with our waste, but the option is not shall we burn it or shall we bury it. The option is let's go up the chain and start getting rid of it so that we don't have it in the
Kia ora. Thank you for that, korero.
Nice place.
So there's a question from Facebook, just in terms of the improving Māori consultation and just the range of opportunities to talk with iwi entities such as Ngāi Tahu and Te Waipounamu, and then hapu and whānau. Any thoughts on how we make sure that any consultation with Māori covers that whole range? Any takers?
Yeah,
Kahurangi?
absolutely. I'll
Kia ora.
jump in here. Yes, so traditionally there's a lot of ways that the government gets Māori input into legislation, and often they're by advisory boards. And of course, an advisory board can make recommendations which are ignored and not entered into. So to me, it's another waste of resource, because these people who could be working on other issues that are really affecting our communities, working on these advisory boards just to have, that work not listened to. So that's where the difference between participation and actual true partnership is. So it's all very well having participation, but if it was a true partnership like this instead of like this, we would hear those voices. And it is so important that we give voices, because we have such a holistic view. Like when we talk about organic waste, and I'm thinking, what about the people who are hungry? Like, why can't we be redistributing this food rather than sending it to landfill? Like Sue said, in a linear fashion, we've got to think broader and that holistic view, which Te Ao Māori does so beautifully. So yeah, really respecting that it may not be in a pretty document, but having space for people to come and share their knowledge and their special skills is so important. So yeah, just having an advisory board of a few people or even one person is not adequate. And yeah, we need to be respecting Te Ao Māori and also Te Tiriti o Waitangi.
Kia ora. And I think COVID, in terms of the response to food insecurity, there's been an enormous growth in food rescue organisations. And again, it's been community organisations, Marae and others, who've really scaled up in that food rescue space to divert food from landfill and to give it to those who are hungry. So a real opportunity there to build that with more support from government. Question from Anne, who's one of the webinar participants on Zoom. Anne says that packaging is a big source of waste, and that Germany made producers, manufacturers responsible for dealing with packaging associated with their products. Is this an option worth pursuing in Aotearoa and worth pursuing through the strategy? Sarah, would you like to, what are your views on that?
Yeah, so one of the priority products you declared, I think it was only a year ago, wasn't it? A year and a half ago, seems so long ago, was single-use plastic packaging. And so that would mean that a regulated product stewardship scheme was designed for plastic packaging, but that has yet to start. So progress hasn't begun on that. But yeah, that's what would happen, is that the producers would need to be responsible through the fee they pay to to diverting it, to finding real solutions for that plastic. And it might help them move to reusable packaging solutions. Ideally, that's what the scheme would do. And there's also a proposal in the legislation for right to return packaging, which could also be part of a regulated product stewardship scheme, where people would have the right to return any packaging back to the retailer. But ideally, that would mean that any packaging returned was not just sent to landfill, but there was actually a real solution for it. So yeah, there needs to be sort of the regulations put in place, which will hopefully motivate businesses to start looking at alternative packaging. And I don't mean other single-use packaging materials. I mean reusable, refillable packaging where possible.
Could you just explain, so that everyone understands exactly how these product stewardship schemes are sort of being designed?
Yes, yeah. Actually, so Kahurangi and I were on co-design around the table as an advisory group for the product stewardship scheme design for electronic products or e-waste. So how that happened is that it was a Tech Collect New Zealand, applied through the Waste Minimisation Fund to lead the co-design process, and they were successful in that application. So about a year after they applied, it was announced, and then they gathered people around the table, stakeholders. So Kahurangi had the weight on her shoulders of being the representative for all Māori, and there was someone from the Zero Waste Network representing community. I was there representing recyclers. There were e-waste recyclers, there were retailer representatives, and so Tech Collect basically had the funds to design the scheme, and they then contracted out a lot of the research to to a consultancy, and our role as the advisors was to hear what they'd come up with and then give our suggestions. So basically we kept pushing for a focus at the top of the waste hierarchy rather than the scheme becoming a default, glorified recycling scheme. So that's how the process happens at the moment, but a lot of people, and the product stewardship sector group that I coordinate is really pushing for a separate entity to drive regulated product stewardship. It could mean hopefully that priority products can be declared more frequently, and that the process can be independent from industry, so that all stakeholders have part of the decision making rather than just giving advice, which can be rejected. So that's one of the things we think there is the need for, as an entity that can keep driving regulated product stewardship and have the program expanded so that more and more products that we have are actually paid for, and that we start to see a shift up the waste hierarchy through these regulated product stewardship schemes. It's basically shifting the responsibility away from councils and consumers and back onto the people who create the waste, which is the producers, the manufacturers.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And so the benefits of this are that it provides a system so that people know what to do with the product at the end of its life, for example, where to take it, and so it doesn't just get put in the wheelie bin.
And at no cost to the consumer.
Yeah. And it also, these schemes ensure that the logistics of where stuff goes, where materials are recovered, and the cost of that are funded from a fee that's paid up front. So that's the key advantage, and that's quite a strong theme in submissions. It's quite a strong thing that needs to come through in submissions to make a much more streamlined process for establishing these schemes so that producers and manufacturers do take responsibility. Kia ora. So Marin, who's participating in the Zoom webinar, says, we've talked a lot about plastics and fossil fuels. What about tyres? Aren't they a major waste product? Is there any plan for managing? I could have a crack at that, because there has been a national environmental standard to regulate the outdoor storage of tyres, because we had problems in Amberley, for example, where there was a big tyre fire because there hadn't been a need to get a resource consent, and now there is over a certain number of tyres, about 1,000. And tyres are also being shredded and then taken to Golden Bay Cement. Their cement works in just south of Whangarei at Portland, and there they're used in the kiln there instead of coal. So there is also a mandatory product stewardship scheme that's being set up for tyres. It's one of the first ones out of the blocks because of the problems of waste tyres. So yes, there is work that's been done there, and there's more information on the MFE website. Sue, do you want to add anything to the tyres issue?
I guess I'll add something which is kind of one step back, which is what's the real problem. We have a system of designing and putting products out onto the market which doesn't actually consider what's going to happen to them at the end of the life. There's no requirement for them to be durable or repairable, or to be, we used to retread tyres when I was a kid. New tyres, you just got a retread applied to the outside and they went for a bit longer. And I think the thing that appeals to me the most about linking circular economy to zero waste in Parakore is the idea that you have two pieces of the puzzle. You have fundamental design changes in the way that goods get put on the market. So that's about business models, it's about the way you design products, it's about the way that you design the systems that get them out there. And then you also have to invest in the recovery chain in the same way we have the supply chain. We've sort of got a weak, sort of very underfunded recovery chain, and for our work we really need to have both pieces working in harmony. So you can't just put a good recycling system in isolation. You have to be designing products that can come around to be repaired, to be recycled, like say Sarah's phone. You've got to have a phone that you can get a new charger for when you lose it, that you can that you can put a new battery in when the battery runs out, that you can put a new screen on when it breaks. And a few things with phones, we could probably keep them going for 4 or 5 times as long. So it's about designing the products better, and then having, it's two sides of the same coin. And that's the power of circular economy, is that it tries to bring both of those things. So in the future, in 30 years, you would hope we don't need product stewardship schemes anymore, because every single product that's designed and put on the market is actually designed with the money it needs to travel through the system in place to be able to look after it, and that its end of life would be such a long time away that it'll be lasting for so long that the end of life is the least of our worries.
Kia ora, Sue. So that's why quite a few submission guides are suggesting that there be changes to the Consumer Guarantees Act to provide a comprehensive right to repair, and that would help that process. Sarah or Kahurangi, do you want to comment on the whole right to repair ethos?
I could talk about that for hours. I'll start.
Maybe not ours, but go for it.
I won't. I'll try to keep it short. Yeah, so right to repair, it can be really narrow, and it can just include, having to provide manuals and spare parts for goods for a certain period, but it can also impact on product design. So overseas in Europe, the European Commission has issued a directive that means that large appliances have to be made to last for a particular number of years. I think it's only 10 years. I think it should be more. And that spare parts and manuals should be available for the whole time, for that whole lifespan. And France is sort of way ahead of everybody else. So they've got things like durability ratings, where the brand rates how durable their product is. They also have a repairability index, so that consumers can see how repairable an item is before they buy it. But they also have, I found that they have a unit they set up. This was from 2015, I found it, and I haven't found any evidence of the unit, but there was a unit proposed to set up to explore whether planned obsolescence was present in French produced appliances. And so they would investigate and to see if there was any deliberate attempt to shorten the lifespan of a product. And if they did find deliberate attempts to shorten the lifespan of a product, then there would the manufacturer would face a massive fine or even imprisonment. So it was being taken really seriously, and France seems to be way ahead of everybody else. But that directive about appliances has also gone throughout Europe, and I know it's been legislated for in the UK as well.
So what you're saying is that if people call for it as part of the waste strategy, there are some good models overseas that New Zealand belatedly could adopt and implement. Yeah,
so it's in there as a proposal, and I think the fact that we're a small country at the bottom of the world shouldn't stop us from aligning ourselves with these policies from overseas. Australia is looking at it right now. We can align ourselves with them, because what we don't want to happen is we don't want to be receiving all the rubbishy products that don't last, like we are at the moment, and can't be repaired. So we want to stop that by aligning ourselves with legislation that's happening overseas, but also extend that protection to Pacific Island nations, because we also don't want to have what we do here impact on them. So that right to repair legislation should be extended to our Pacifica whānau.
Thank you. So there's a question from Thomas. How do you propose to stop waste at the border, given that we are importing most of our consumer goods? So that's focusing on the very top of the hierarchy, avoid. Kahurangi, would you like to have first crack at that?
Yeah, sure. And that's part of, part of the product stewardship design is that does the fee go on when those products are imported into the country and go into like a national fee, a national account that then gets filtered out to behaviour change models and community initiatives like the Repair Cafe Aotearoa New Zealand, which has just had its launch, and normalising repair, and also all the parts along the repair line. So yeah, absolutely looking at the importers and where it first comes in. And then, I would love to see products banned from coming in here. If they aren't durable, if they aren't able to be repaired, they just don't get to come. And like Sarah said, then they're not going, we're not pawning that off to other smaller nations who don't have the infrastructure like we do. Yeah.
Kia ora, Kahurangi. There have been a couple of questions about plastics. One about how do we incentivise through the strategy or through the legislation New Zealand to reduce soft plastic use? How do we encourage recycling of soft plastics on a larger scale? And what about reducing production of plastic fibres, clothes made out of plastic fibres? Sue, would you like to go first in that one? So the whole issue of soft
Yeah,
plastics and plastics and fabric, textiles. And what do we need in the waste strategy to really help tackle this?
it's a tricky one. It goes back to that point that I was making earlier about if you just accept the products that you're given through a certain system, then you're stuck with a model of delivery. So our big scale supermarkets, which supply us with materials that have traveled a long way, and foodstuffs that have traveled a long way and that have been packaged up in some other country or some other city and sent through to us, are always going to be delivering us our goods in those types of containers. We need to think, like, in the short term, one thing we can do is to buy local, to have much shorter supply chains where you can get material, you can buy your goods in different ways. So you can go to a market which has, get your groceries in Wellington. We have a market that you can go down to in the weekend, just take your shopping bag, pile it all in. So there's some strategies like that, but really the long game is to shift it so that it's easy for everyone to get their everything they need in good packaging, or to buy textiles that are not shedding fibre every time we wash. And that's really by using the kind of the new models of thinking about how we produce things, which are based on a value chain. And the idea of that is really that you have to connect the dots between all the different people that are part of that system to be able to have an impact on that. And so in the UK, we can see organisations like WRAP, who work from the paddock to the plate kind of system, and then also back around to get composting happening. And they're looking at things like the emissions from all the different stages of food production. They're looking at the consequences for chemicals going into soil. They're looking at the packaging choices that are being made. They're looking at the emissions, the emissions consequences of all the refrigeration in the process. And I think that the future is really designing the system so that we don't need to receive our things in a certain type of package. At the moment, we're pretty trapped in that system, and really one of the things we get told is that as consumers, that's what we have asked for, but I really think that's what we're being given. And it's not that I said to my local New World, oh, please could I have more plastic packaging wrapped around my food? It actually just comes like that, and your thing that you used to came in a paper bag now comes in a plastic bag. And so I think we really need to tackle it on two fronts. The choices you can make as an individual, but they're often quite challenging under the current system because it's not really set up for us to do a good job around plastics, but then also going back up the chain. And I think as people realize that plastics are really just, fossil fuel, we're going to see a lot of changes around that sort of packaging as well. And some of those big supermarkets in the UK are really pushing on a lot of that stuff now.
Kia ora, Sue, and I'll come back to you for a final comment, but Kahurangi, you were nodding a bit there, and we've also had a comment from Kat. What about looking at opportunities to have less resources in the first place, which is sort of a theme you've touched on, and facilities to enable us to share more? So do you have any final comments and maybe sort of respond to that challenge that's been raised by Kat about sharing more?
Absolutely. I was just struggling to get my mute button off there. Absolutely, tautoko, what Sue was saying about at the moment, the system is that we get our stuff like that. And yeah, we can go to our local farmers market, and if we've got time to, we can go to the community garden and go and volunteer there and grow our own kai. But it's about behaviour change comes from system change, which we saw with the plastic bag ban. And so that's where we need to be asking in the legislation for changes. There is already so many solutions away from having that single-use plastic. So we need to see that implemented really quickly, and it needs to be exciting and fun for people. It needs to acknowledge and give respect to the resources that we're taking from Papatūānuku. That plastic is oil, that is fossil fuels, that is coming from deep within Papatūānuku, literally a gift, and we need to keep those fossil fuels in the ground. So finding other ways to get rid of plastic, and then the microplastics as well. It's just a lot, isn't it? And so it's great that the Plastics Innovation Fund is coming, and we need to be giving some of those funds to Māori-led organisations. I think in the last 10 years, the Waste Minimisation Fund's only given 1% of funding to Māori, and that's just not acceptable. So yeah, looking at systemic change and community initiatives and believing in community.
Kia ora, Kahurangi, and a big theme for people to push in their submissions. Any final points from you, Sarah?
Yeah, I just want to touch on that synthetic, the microplastics and synthetics, because I've been quite obsessed about this recently. And I think that's why we need a systems approach, because on the one hand, we have synthetic carpets that have been pushed on people. Apparently, I heard recently from a council that a school was really, had to really fight to get wool carpet in their school. And then they're only allowed it in a really small section. So there's no joining the dots between synthetic carpets, procurement policies for all of government, including the public sector, and microplastics. And also, on the other hand, we have this beautiful natural resource that we have plenty of in Aotearoa, and that is wool. And a farmer said to me, this is the biggest waste material we have from farms at the moment. It's not food waste, it's wool. It's just not able to be sold. So if we connect those dots up and start using natural wool again for carpets, and fighting for it, even if you have to fight with your insurer for it, or the school has to fight for it. But procurement is something that could really drive this change, and I think there needs to be more focus on public sector procurement. So central government, local government, schools, hospitals, prisons, whoever else, police, all need to be on the same kaupapa when it comes to procurement, and be choosing or having to choose, not actually choosing, being told that they need to buy products that can be repaired, can be reused, are reused, and also don't leak microplastics. So that's one thing from me. Probably enough. I've probably said enough.
No, kia ora, Sarah. Just in terms of those procurement guidelines, government is doing some work through MBI, but I think if that is a major theme in submissions, there's so much scope to make them so much better. Kia ora. Sue, any final concluding comment from you?
Yeah, I guess that just reminded me of what really annoyed me when I first read the document. There's a lot of pressure in the document on the individual or the family or the little guys at the bottom of the cliff that are really often doing everything they can to try to change. And what I would love people to submit on is that they really want government to step up. 20 years, we just really haven't, apart from when Eugenie was pushing the barrow really hard while you were the minister, we really haven't seen any traction in the waste sphere. And we have to see it not just in waste, it has to go up into MB, it has to go into MPI. And that's one reason I think the circular economy can be useful to us, because it kind of between business, which is where all this waste is coming from, and the environment, which is where it's a lot of it's either being taken out of or ending up back in. And I think that unless we can join those dots together, we're really struggling. So I'd encourage you to really push for the Ministry for the Environment to work with MB and MPI to get things sorted in the regulatory side, and to push the money from the waste fund out into the community so that people can do that practical work around zero waste stuff, and also the behaviour change. Delegate some of your tasks, government, so that you can work with your mates and get some rules sorted so that we don't have these problems in the first place.
Kia ora, Sue. That's a very good place to bring it to a close, I think. Can I thank Sue, Kahurangi, Sarah, on behalf of everyone who's tuned in today for their contribution and all of their mahi that goes on outside of this that has brought that expertise to our webinar today. Can I thank you for all tuning in, for being interested in waste and hopefully taking the next step and actually making a submission. There've been the links to the parakore, to the zero waste and to the green submission guides that have been in the chat. But Rosalie will also circulate those in an email tomorrow. Submissions close on the 10th of December and there is a whole lot of questions, as Sue highlighted. Don't feel that you have to answer all the questions. There's a section
Yeah,
at the end of the digital document
that's
where
right.
you can just put your views. Government agencies like to have specific questions. It doesn't mean you have to answer them all. And if anyone would like to put any farewell messages in the chat, you're very welcome. Can I thank you all for your questions tonight and your attention and time? We didn't get to all of them, but we did get to quite a few of them. And can I also thank Rosalie, who's been doing all of the mahi behind the scenes to make the webinar work and is connected with people. So just a karakia to close. Tutawa mai I runga, tutawa mai I raro, tutawa mai I roto, tutawa mai I waho, kia tō ai, te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, taikie. Come forth from above, come forth from below, come forth from within and from the environment, vitality and well-being for all, strengthened in unity. Kia ora. Ka kite anō. Mahere wā.
Mā te wā.
Mā te wā.